Get started. People will, keep coming through here. All right, everybody, welcome. This is the Western Center's second Western College Legacy Seminar this semester. And we'll be hearing from the authors of From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, Ms. A. Kirsten Mullen and Dr. William Darity. We'll discuss what is perhaps the most comprehensive case and plan to date for Black reparations in the US. So we're really excited about this. I'd like to open the program with Miami University's land acknowledgement. Miami University is located within the traditional homelands of the Miamia and Shawnee peoples, who, along with other indigenous groups, ceded these lands to the United States in the first Treaty of Greenville in 1795. The Miami people, whose name our university carries, were forcibly removed from these homelands in 1846. In 1972, a relationship between Miami University and the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma began and evolved into a reciprocal partnership, including the creation of the Miamia Center at Miami University in 2001. The work of the Miamia Center serves the Miami Tribe community and is dedicated to the revitalization of Miami language and culture and to restoring that knowledge to the Miamia people. Miami University and the Miami Tribe are proud of this work and of the more than 140 Miamia students who have attended since 1991 through the Miamia Heritage Award Program. Ms. Mullen and Dr. Darity's talk tonight is one of the many pieces of co-curricular and academic programming that the Western Center for Social Impact and Innovation sponsors throughout the year. We'll post a sign-in sheet in the chat later during the program for those of you receiving course credit for participating. And also you can certainly post questions in the Q&A section of this throughout the program, but we'll leave some time at the end for those to be moderated and answered. I will hand it over to Dr. Rodney Coates, Program Director for Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, as well as collaborating scholar with the Western Center on its biennial theme of reparations and restorative justice.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Oftentimes when we do these introductions, someone makes a statement about high honor and distinct pleasure. Well, this evening, I can truly say with all honesty that it is my honor and esteemed pleasure to introduce Ms. Kirsten Mullen and Dr. William Sandy Darity Jr. Ms. Mullen is a folklorist and the founder of the Artefactual and Arts Consulting Practice and Carolina Circuit Writers, a literary consortium that brings expressive writers of color to the Carolinas. She was a member of the Freelon Bond Concept Development Team that was awarded the Smithsonian Institution's commission to design the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Under the auspices of the North Carolina Arts Council, she worked to expand the Coastal Folklore Survey. As a faculty member with the Community Folklife Documentation Institute, she trained students to research and record the state's African American music heritage. Kirsten was a consultant on the North Carolina Museum of History's North Carolina Legends and Civil Rights exhibition projects. Her writings in museum catalogs, journals, and in commercial media includes Black Culture and History Matter, which examines the politics of funding Black culture institutions. She and Professor Darity are the authors of From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. Professor, Dr. Esteemed William Sandy Darity Jr. is the Samuel DuBois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African American Studies, Economics and Business, and the founding director of the Samuel DuBois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. His served as chair of the Department of African and African American Studies and was the founding director of the Research Network on Racial and Ethnic Inequality at Duke. Professor Darity's research focuses on inequality by race, class, and ethnicity, stratification, economic, schooling, and racial achievement gaps. North-South theories of trade and development, skin shade and labor market outcomes, the economics of reparations, the Atlantic slave trade and the Industrial Revolution, the history of economics, and the social psychological effects of exposure to unemployment. His most recent book, co-authored with Professor Mullen, is From Here to Equality. But past that, I've known Sandy for over 30 years. He's always been an upright scholar, cutting edge, and one of the most brilliant minds that America has to offer. He is one of America's valued resources. And without any other comments on my part, Dr. Darity and Ms. Mullen, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for that introduction. It's actually quite moving, so thank you so much. I'd like to say that Dr. Coates is one of the scholars who I deeply admire and cherish the fact that we are also good friends. And that's a wonderful combination in the academic world. And I'd also like to thank Jackie Doherty and Billy Sims for all the support and help they've given us in the process of making this virtual visit to Miami of Ohio. And I think I mentioned to Dr. Doherty that I suspect that we're actually distant relatives, given the similarity of our last names and the fact that both of our families are from North Carolina. So that's another interesting sidelight to all of this. But Kirsten Mullen and I are always thrilled to have the opportunity to discuss reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. And so we're grateful for the opportunity to do that here with the Miami of Ohio community. And I think Kirsten's going to start our presentation, and then after that, we'll be glad to try to take questions.
Thank you, Sandy. I want to begin first by saying I'm an independent scholar, but I'm not a professor. So I want to begin by talking about ARC, A-R-C. So we want to start by defining what we mean by reparations, so we can all, have the same shared understanding of what we believe is possible. Reparations are a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. The reparations claim we want to focus on here today is not solely based upon slavery. Rather, we are talking about the full scope of American history, slavery, yes, the fiery crucible upon which white supremacy emanated, but also nearly 100 years of legal segregation and the White Terror campaigns, more commonly known as Jim Crow. And finally, the present moment, dating from the passage of civil rights legislation in the mid to late 1960s, that is marked by ongoing police killings of unarmed Black women and men, mass incarceration, discrimination in housing, in the workplace and education, and the stigmatization that accompanies these atrocities. The acronym ARC, A-R-C. By acknowledgement, we mean the perpetrators of these harms admit their involvement and, importantly, admit that they have benefited from these actions, benefited materially from these actions. For Black Americans, this means not just the receipt of an apology, but the recognition that the commitment for redress, the R of ARC, is coming from the American people as a whole. The goal of redress or restitution is to move the descendants of U.S. slavery to an equitable position commensurate with the status they would have attained had these injustices not occurred over the previous 150 years. For African Americans, restitution would eliminate racial disparities in wealth, which we will talk about in some detail, and also racial disparities in income, in education, health, sentencing and incarceration, and political participation, and put Blacks in a better position to engage in American political and social life. Lastly, closure, the C in ARC, involves the mutual conciliation between African Americans and the beneficiaries of slavery, legal segregation and white terrorist campaigns, and ongoing discrimination towards Blacks. We say conciliation and not reconciliation because there never has been a moment when these crimes were discussed honestly and remorse expressed. The perpetrators, that is those who have benefited from these abuses, have never admitted the many, many ways that they have benefited. This would require good faith action to own all of the acts of the past and to confront the present and vow to behave differently and to act differently, to act equitably going forward. Once the reparations program is executed and racial inequality is eliminated, Blacks would make no race-specific claims, Blacks would make no further race-specific claims against the American government on the assumption that no new race-specific claims are inflicted upon them and that old harms are not revived.
We insist that the term reparations be reserved for a comprehensive policy of redress for Black American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. And specifically, we argue that Black reparations must refer to a project that eliminates the nation's staggering racial wealth gap. The Black share in wealth is considerably lower than the percentage of Blacks in the nation's population. This translates into a condition where the average Black household has a net worth, based upon data from the 2019 Survey of Consumer Finances, $841,900 lower than the average white household. Indeed, we argue that given that racial wealth gap, a true reparations plan must incorporate 4 essential elements. I'm going to talk about the first 3, and then Kirsten's going to talk about the 4th one. So the first of these pillars of a comprehensive reparations plan, the first of these pillars must dictate that eligible recipients are individuals who have self-identified as Black, Negro, African American, or Afro-American for at least 12 years before adoption of a reparations plan or a study commission for reparations. This is a condition that we refer to as an identity standard for eligibility. But there is also a second standard, and both of these must be met for an individual to be eligible. And the second standard is a person must demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States of America. And this is what we refer to as a lineage standard. This is the community, the individuals who meet these 2 standards. This is the community that has suffered accrued intergenerational effects of slavery, legal segregation, sustained white terrorism, and ongoing atrocities like discrimination, mass incarceration, and anti-Black police violence. This is the community whose ancestors were promised 40-acre land grants as restitution for their years of bondage, a promise that never was met. We are talking about, in thinking about the racial wealth gap, what economist William Spriggs calls the cumulative compound effects of stolen opportunities. So that leads us to the second pillar of a comprehensive reparations plan. A true reparations plan requires the erasure of Black and white differences in wealth by building Black assets to a level comparable to those held by whites. The racial gap in net worth is a product of national policies that promoted white wealth accumulation and Black wealth decumulation. The racial wealth gap is the premier economic indicator of the full effects of white supremacy since the Republic was founded in 1776. As of late 2020, Black American descendants of US slavery are 12% of the nation's population, but only possess less than 2% of the nation's wealth. In contrast, white Americans are closer to 70% of the nation's population, but possess in excess of 90% of the nation's wealth. If we were going to raise the Black share of wealth to match the Black share of the nation's population, this would require an expenditure in the vicinity of at least $14 trillion. Now, there's a third characteristic of a comprehensive reparations plan, and that is true reparations requires direct payments to eligible recipients. In previous cases of group-based reparations, payments were made directly to members of the affected community. For example, Germany's payments to victims of the Holocaust, and the US government's payments to Japanese Americans who were unjustly subjected to mass incarceration during the course of World War II. In addition, there are instances in which the US government has provided reparations to individuals who suffered atrocities that the US government was not responsible for directly. And so one example of this are the funds that were given to families that lost loved ones during the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Another example is the reparations that now are being paid to individuals who were held captive in Iran under the regime of the Ayatollah Khomeini. These individuals are being paid $10,000 per day of captivity. And since the typical captive was held for 440 days, we're talking about a payout of $4.4 million per person. So we argue that funds should not be funneled through a third-party institution that denies eligible recipients full discretion over their use. It's critical that direct payments be made to the eligible recipients.
So the fourth pillar, the federal government is the culpable party, and it must pay the debt. That is the fourth pillar. And from here to equality, we argue that the culpable party is the United States government. Authority is constructed and contextual, and all three phases of atrocities that have occurred since the nation's founding, slavery, nearly 100 years of legal segregation, Jim Crow, and 100 years of white terror campaigns, and the moment from the passage of the Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s to the present, were products of the legal and authority framework established by the federal government. In many instances, the federal government further sanctioned racial atrocities by silence and inaction. In fact, the federal government is the only entity with the capacity to pay the debt. State and local governments do not have the capacity to handle a debt of this magnitude. The total annual budget for the nation's city and state budgets is about $3.5 trillion, at least $10.5 trillion short of what is needed to close the chasm. As Sandy said, $14 trillion on the low end. City and state governments would have to devote their entire budgets for nearly 4 consecutive years to retire this debt.
Now, what we'd like to talk about next are a couple of detours away from reparations that appear to be steps to be taken on the path to reparations. So they're illusory in that sense. There's one set of objections to reparations or barriers to reparations that are associated with the attitudes and outlook of individuals who are opposed to reparations as a matter of principle. Frequently, their opposition to reparations is anchored in a set of misperceptions, either misperceptions about the causes of the racial wealth gap or misperceptions about the nation's history, particularly the period of slavery, the Civil War, and the Reconstruction era. But there's another set of obstacles that have been created for true reparations that emerge from individuals who appear on the face of it to be ardent advocates of reparations. And the first of these is a piece of legislation that has been in Congress for upwards of 30 years that promises to establish a study commission for reparations that would give Congress proposals for plans of redress to be provided for Black Americans. We argue that this particular piece of legislation, known as H.R. 40, in reference to the promise, the unfulfilled promise of the 40-acre land grants, we argue that this bill is deeply flawed, and we probably would be better off if this bill never is successful in being enacted by the National Congress. There are two sets of flaws that we'd like to highlight. The first is a set that we refer to as structural deficiencies, and then the second set is as an array of problems that we refer to as the substantive deficiencies. So what are the structural deficiencies? Well, the first is the following. The bill as currently written specifies that the Federal Advisory Committee Act is not applicable to this commission. Let me repeat that. The first objection we have is the Federal Advisory Committee Act is not applicable to this commission. Why is that a problem? The Federal Advisory Committee Act ensures that all advisory groups for Congress engage in transparent deliberations. For example, hold hearings, hold public meetings, and provide ongoing reports of their activities prior to delivery of the final report. And indeed, in terms of holding meetings and hearings, these must be public events under the terms of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. If that is not applicable to this commission, the commission can proceed with all of its deliberations behind closed doors. Secondly, the bill currently written provides each member of the commission with pay at a daily rate of up to Executive 4 level on the federal salary scale, which is currently $172,000 per annum. The commission now has a timeline of 18 months, so this means that pay could run as high as $253,000 per member. Now, we've long argued that it is inappropriate for members of a commission of this type, a commission with this sacred mission, for members to receive pay. Of course, they should receive compensation for their normal expenses and serving on the commission, and there should be a paid professional staff to support their efforts, both in terms of various dimensions of logistics as well as the research that's going to be required. But the members of the commission themselves should not receive salaries. The presence of the paid professional staff will enable them to maintain their normal lives of employment while they serve. And we should not want members of a commission of this type who will not serve unless they receive a salary. Third, originally the bill had provisions for 7 members appointed by, first, the president, second, the Speaker of the House, and third, the President pro tempore of the Senate. Between 2015-16 and 2017-18, between those sessions of Congress, the organizations NARC and NCOBRA rewrote the bill to expand the number to 13, adding 6 members who were described as representatives of organizations with a legacy of promoting reparations. Now, at the time, there were no specifics given about how the 6 would be selected or appointed. The version of the bill that came out of markup in April 2021 now specifies 15 members. 9 of them appointed by the president, the speaker, and the president pro tempore of the Senate, and the additional 6 selected by the administrative director of the commission, who will be appointed in turn by the chair and the vice chair. This is a very odd internal selection of the additional 6 members. These 6 members will be beholden directly to the chair and the vice chair of the commission. And then finally, the bill as currently written says no elected official or public employee can be a member of the commission. Now, we should note that federal law would make any of these persons who are elected officials or public servants, make them unable to receive salaries. The law prohibits it. Consequently, the bill as currently written ensures that every member will have eligibility to receive a salary. Let me add one more point, which is a quorum on this commission is 7 persons, less than half of the total of 15 that are specified in the bill. Okay. Kirsten's going to talk about the substantive weaknesses. Yeah.
So yes, what is absent from HR 40, right? The substance, the meat that's missing. And basically it's the 4 pillars of true reparations program that Say and I have shared. So the first of those 4, HR 40 does not specify who the eligible recipients would be. And for us, those are individuals who could individuals who meet 2 standards, a lineage standard and an identity standard. So these are individuals who could, demonstrate that they are descended from at least one person who was enslaved in the United States, and who for 12 years prior to the creation of a study commission on reparations or the enactment of a reparations commission, self-identified as Black, African-American, Afro-American, or Negro. Right? So that's the first substantive problem with HR 40. The bill does not specify the elimination of the racial wealth gap as its key goal. And as Sandy said, we're talking about a payment of $14 trillion on the low end that it would take to retire this debt, but that's not referenced in HR 40. The bill does not indicate that restitution should be paid directly to the eligible recipients, and not to some third party. And since we have many examples internationally, in the United States itself, where restitution in cases like this were paid directly to the victims, not to some other entity. And also, no one has said, in the case of Japanese Americans who were victims of incarceration during World War II, there were additional funds made available for education purposes so that the nation would be made aware of the unconstitutional actions of the federal government and the restitution that was paid. And now, in fact, those funds were significantly, that part of the budget was significantly gutted during Bill Clinton's administration, but those funds were there initially. But it's really important for, those funds not to be, the fund, if you're going to have education funds, that should be a separate category of funds. One should not divert the funds that would have gone to the victims for these other purposes, for education purposes, for scholarships, for publications, et cetera. That should be a separate kind of bucket of funding. And then fourthly, HR 40 critically does not specify who will pay the bill. The debt, that is the elimination of the racial wealth gap, was created by the federal government, and it is the federal government's debt to pay. They are the culpable party and they are the capable party, and they should be made to pay, and that should be included in the bill.
So in addition to the detour that's created by HR 40, the other set of detours are associated with what we refer to as piecemeal reparations plans. particularly plans for reparations or so-called reparations that are adopted and embraced by cities and states across the country. Some elected officials are indeed owning their governing body's racist practices and devising programs of atonement. And from our perspective, this is, of course, a good thing. But what is problematic is not accurately labeling these types of policies, and instead inaccurately labeling them as reparations and giving the impression that these initiatives constitute restitution for the full array of injustices that Blacks have endured. Two of these local cases include Evanston, Illinois' housing voucher plan, where the city is providing individuals who experienced discrimination in the housing market between 1919 and 1969, $25,000 vouchers. Now, one of the issues is here, of course, is that the total budget that's being allocated for this is at a maximum $10 million, which means that 400 households could be recipients of the vouchers. And thus far, they only have had $400,000 available, which could provide these vouchers for 16 households, and they've had to determine who receives them on the basis of a lottery. So that's one set of issues. But then the other surrounds the fact that the $25,000 figure in and of itself is problematic. The median home value in Evanston, Illinois is in the vicinity of $450,000. And so a housing voucher of $25,000 is not going to take you very far in terms of meeting the demands of a down payment. And then an additional issue is the fact that the funds go directly to the very same banks that engaged in the discriminatory practices. They do not go directly to the individual recipients. They are funneled through the banking system. The second example of local reparations, which is going wrong, is a program in Vermont in which individual white Americans are making payments directly to individual Black Americans, ostensibly as a form of reparative justice. The problem we have here is that, of course, it's impossible for individuals to meet the bill that is required. If a group of generous donors placed $1 billion into a fund for reparations on a monthly basis, so it'd be $12 billion per annum, it would take a millennium to get to $14 trillion. So this is an impossibility. And furthermore, we do not think that reparations is a matter of individual guilt. It is a matter of collective national responsibility.
Or just go to the
This is you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Talk about it.
so what is there for cities and states to do, right? What we have advocated is that they do two things, kind of the both and that would be to advocate for a true program of reparations, to lobby and petition Congress. This could be done through resolutions, it could be done through petitions, it could be done through letter writing campaigns, but to say that, I'm a registered voter, it's important to me that the US government pay reparations to Black American descendants of US slavery, but also to point out the deficiencies of HR 40, to ask your elected officials at every level, are they aware of the contents of HR 40? Have they taken the time to consider what the consequences will be of the legislation as written? Are they aware that during the markups that have occurred, that there is no oversight, no public oversight with the bill as the bill is written currently? I think one of the things that has been startling to us in our conversations with elected officials is learning how few of them have read the bill. In fact, I don't know that we have actually encountered anyone who said that they had read the bill.
No, not straight up.
No, including people who have signed the bill. So, I think everyone has just assumed that they knew what it said.
Or that it was
a good bill. It had to be a good bill. But in fact, they have not read it and are not really aware of what it does and does not say. But one of the things the other thing that we would encourage folk to do is to clean your own house. To take a look around and see, what kinds of work are you committed to in your own community? When you are consulting, thought leaders, who are they? Do they look like you? Or do they represent, the nation as a whole? If there are contracts to let, if you are hiring, if you have a search committee, is the committee as diverse as the nation? Are you a member of a sundown department? We talk about sundown towns, places where Black people were welcome to work, but could not live and had to vacate by sundown or face, dire consequences. So, there are a lot of things that we can do, paying attention, coordinating our formal and informal communities, whether they be our family members, people we work with, our crafts, beer collectives, our artisan, our ultimate Frisbee groups. There are a lot of groups to which we belong. And we would say, turn the magnifying glass on yourself first and interrogate your own situation and find out if you are walking your talk. But then also come together to lobby and petition Congress. One of the states that is trying to focus on this issue is California. And they have legislation in AB 3121 that created a reparations task force. Now, we would argue that it's not possible for the state of California to eliminate the racial wealth gap, which is what we believe is the chief goal of reparations. I believe the annual budget for the state of California is about $260 or so billion. And to retire the racial wealth gap, California has about 2.6 million Black people, would require $700 billion. So the state of California clearly cannot eliminate the racial wealth gap, even if they wanted to, for their residents. But what could they do instead? So we have proposed that they consider creating a tribunal that would look at the harms that have taken place in the state against their Black residents, and help individuals, help families pull together the necessary documentation, and then calculate, as we do in our courts all the time, a payment for their pain and suffering. You could be talking about illegal property takings, about people being folks who like myself spent the first many years of their schooling in segregated schools, individuals who were discriminated against in the workplace, or who did not receive adequate or quality health care through a state system, mass incarceration, and police excessive and unwarranted police violence. There are a number of harms that these tribunals could take up, and we would propose that they would do, both help to define what the harms are, help to create the research to make the documentation available to families so that they can make their claims, and then also help to adjudicate those claims. But we don't advocate that cities or states try to pay, make these monetary payments that are somehow going to, in their words, be reparations, because they don't have the capacity to do it. It just isn't possible. And it's confusing to use that terminology. So we would like to see these initiatives be called racial equity initiatives and not reparations at all. Yeah.
So we'll stop there.
Yes. And your questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mullen and Dr. Darity. We want to open the floor up for questions. So if you could use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen for that, that would be great. I'll also receive them via chat. It'll give us an opportunity to see if there are any parallels and not repeat questions. I would like to start out with one question, and thank you both so much for what was a very succinct and powerful layout of exactly what we need to be doing and what we are doing and what we aren't doing at this point in time. The question that I have, and now teaching a class with Dr. Coates on reparations, we get a lot of questions on this, is that, according to a 2021 poll done by sociologists Reichelman and Hunt, 72% of white Americans are opposed to one of your pillars in terms of Black reparations, which is individual payments for reparations. White Americans, a slight majority of them, are in favor of more symbolic aspects, such as a memorial or a national apology for slavery, for example. But very few, under 12% actually, are in favor of cash payments, according to this most recent poll.
No, it's 28%.
Yeah,
28%. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was just checking my numbers as I was talking.
I mean, it's close to 30%.
Right.
Not bad.
So actually, you should flip that poll on its head
and talk about
because in the year 2000, when a similar poll was taken by Ravana Popoff and Michael Dawson at the University of Chicago, it was 4% of white Americans who endorsed monetary payments as reparations for Black Americans. And that percentage had risen to about 16% by 2018.
Almost at the percentage
and now it's closer to 30%. So I think one of the problems with that study is that they didn't really pay any attention to the trajectory of opinion on reparations, and 30% is substantially different from 4%. So we don't know if this movement is sustainable, but it certainly gives you grounds for optimism rather than pessimism looking at the results of that study.
And not to negate that, but do you have any thoughts or suggestions on ways that more white Americans can be moved to considering cash payments and individual payments?
One of the things that we have seen when we've been giving presentations and talking about these the massacres that occurred, that there were 100 of them. Some people may have heard something about the Red Summer, just 1919, and perhaps they have some knowledge of the case of Elaine, Arkansas, where Black farmers attempted to collectively market their wares and to get a higher payment away from their town than they had traditionally been able to get. And the local whites just said, no, that's not going to happen. You're not going to get a competitive wage. We're going to determine how much money you make. We're going to determine who gets to sell what, and we're willing to fight to the death, to make that happen. Many people, Black and white, are not aware of these travesties. They weren't taught. I certainly didn't learn them growing up in Fort Worth, Texas, going to both public and private schools. That was a revelation to me, to learn that children were targeted, that women were targeted, that people were burned in their houses. And when they tried to run out, that people just shot them down like dogs. I think, we don't know our history, and there's a reason for that. Tanya's talked about,
these folks would not have shot dogs.
You're right about that.
Mm-hmm.
You're right about that. I should have said, I don't know, shot down like animals for food, perhaps. But yes, they treated their dogs better than they did Black people. Where's I going with this? The numbers of atrocities, the sustained manner that they were taking place in. We learned, many people are aware of the Tulsa massacre of 1921 because the anniversary was given a lot of light last year, with both Donald Trump and then Joe Biden both going to Tulsa. But that was news for a lot of people. And certainly, learning that, was it 36 blocks of the Black Business District were destroyed. And then the residential adjacent to that, and that, the white mobsters used decommissioned federal airplanes and dropped fire bombs on Black people and their business. So they were burning them from the top and shooting into them at the same time. Many people were not aware of just the incredible barbarism of these attacks, and how many people were injured, killed, and all the refugees that these massacres created. In North Carolina, very recently, the public has learned about a massacre in Wilmington in 1898. Both of our children they're adults now, went to school in North Carolina, grade school. And I think it's 6th or 7th grade where you learn North Carolina history. This was not in their textbooks, at all. It's talked about quite a bit now. And many people say, oh, this is the first coup that occurred because the whites, you had a Black and white co-governance. There were a significant number of Black people who were magistrates, or police officers, justices of the peace. And this was because the Democrats had been disenfranchised because they would not, complete the loyalty oath, and they would not, pledge allegiance to the United States. And so they were not allowed to vote, but the Republicans were able to vote, and they were very successful. And the white Democrats said, oh, this is not the way things should be. We don't really care that these people were elected legally. We are going to reverse this. And they, burned down first the Black newspaper, other Black businesses, Black residences. Black people fled, many of them with just the clothes on their backs. And within a few days, the white people who had led those attacks installed themselves as the elected officials. There was no new election. They just kind of said, who wants to be mayor? Who wants to be, deputy? And that's how it went. But in our research, we discovered a almost identical situation in Fort Bend County, Texas in 1888. So 10 years prior. And it's as if, there was a playbook, because the Texas Democrats wrote a manifesto, which they called the White Men's Declaration of Independence, and 441 of them signed it. That document exists. And they spelled out, we will not be ruled by, men of African origin again. 10 years later, you have the people, the white Democrats in Wilmington declaring their own independence and using almost the same language. And over 200 of them signed that document. But we know of riots, white riots and massacres that occurred at least as early as 1873 and 74 in Colfax and Coushatta, Louisiana. But what all of these massacres have in common is after they burned out these Black communities, after they murdered, maimed, and caused these folks to flee, many, many, many times, they also stepped in and appropriated their property. And you find in places like Ocoee, Florida, where, again, Black people went to the polls and voted, but the local whites were not, going to accept the results of the election, and they rioted. But then you see after the riot, after the Black people have fled, transfers of property, so sales of property, and 2 acres, 3 acres, 20 acres, 5 acres, 100 acres. The sale price is what, $5 or $1 or $10. So were these legal, sales? These voluntary sales is what they were called. That's how they are entered in the deed books. It's a shameful history, but it's the truth. And
I think your big point is that this is a history. When people learn about it,
yes,
it does tend to move them.
Yeah. And then, we also learned looking at the research of one of our colleagues, Jacqueline Dowd Hall, who's a historian, who has looked at these history books, like why don't we, more, I can't tell you how many times people have said to us, why don't we know this? And we said that to each other, like, how is this, how is it possible that we don't know these things? Well, there's a reason for that. And that's because you had groups like the Daughters of the American Revolution and the United Daughters of the Confederacy who commissioned history textbooks for school children. One of the high schools that I attended in Fort Worth was in Mount Pleasant, Texas, which is on the Arkansas border. And we had a Daughters of the American Revolution chapter in our high school. Okay. And we had one of those textbooks that they had commissioned that probably had been in place for 20 years. And I'll bet was in place another 20 after I was a student.
Was there some outcry about, how the presence of this chapter was making Black students feel uncomfortable?
I certainly was uncomfortable, but nobody was really interested in my feelings or the feelings of any of my Black classmates. We were just made to sit there and, be bewildered, really, because the textbooks, these were textbooks that glorified the Confederacy, that barely talked about Reconstruction. And if Reconstruction, when Reconstruction was mentioned, it was a sham. This was a farce. It was, you had the huckster carpetbaggers and the scalawags, and you had these Black people who didn't deserve to be elected, who were not educated, who were not, men of renown, when in fact, the Black men who served during the Reconstruction period were in many, many cases, far more educated than were their white counterparts. But they also, didn't talk about the positive things that came out of Reconstruction. Before Reconstruction, we didn't have public education for Black or white children in the South. This is the first time that there was a conversation about having similar per capita expenditures for Black and white schools. Now, a lot of the local school boards did not follow through with that, but that was something that the legislatures did recommend. Infrastructure projects were undertaken by any number of those Reconstruction era elected leaders, but that's not what's talked about. I certainly knew nothing about that. In our history, what we know of it, in large measure, comes from movies. Gone with the Wind and Birth of a Nation, which are fiction. And not only that, but when you think about the work of G.W. Griffith, these folks had a serious axe to grind, in the work they were doing. I mean, this was propaganda at its highest. It was not history. And, but at the same time, the misperceptions that we have about the racial wealth gap, how large it is, how it was created, how it's maintained, and our own miseducation about our own history are things that we believe two major roadblocks for reparations. But, events like this, the class that you and Professor Coates are teaching, certainly will go a long way to educating, your students, but also the community of University of Miami, Ohio. And we hope that there will be many other conversations like this. I mean, it's extraordinary to me that the reparations conversation has been, somewhat sustained, I would say, for at least the last 3 to 4 years. It's not a new conversation. Enslaved Black people have been trying to become emancipated and to be paid for their labors since they arrived on these shores in shackles. And there have been any number of individuals and organizations over the centuries that have come together to try to bring reparations to fruition. But the sustained conversation that is taking place is something to celebrate. That is news. And as more people are going to the web, or going to their libraries, or going to bookstores, and taking advantage of the scholarship that is available, I think there will be many, many more people who will say, this makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. We had a couple of questions about some of the logistics, and I think a main one is if you could give us a little detail about, just a little detail about how the $14 trillion has been computed.
Yeah. So we are working with an estimate of the total Black population in the United States of 45 million people. And we are working with a companion estimate that 90% of those individuals would be persons who were descendants of people enslaved in the United States. And so that would be about 40 million people. I think I mentioned earlier that the Survey of Consumer Finances for 2019 indicates that the average differential in wealth between Black and white households is somewhere in the vicinity of about $842,000. Well, if you take into account household size, the per person gap is closer to $350,000. And if you multiply $350,000 times 40 million people, you get a number that's in the vicinity of $14 trillion.
Thank you. A couple of questions on this work at the federal level. Can you say a little bit more about the distinction that you made between the financial responsibility for reparations falling on the federal government rather than individual people or municipalities and state level?
In regards to the federal government is that, as we said, they are the capable party and they're the culpable party. And capable because none of these other groups, individually or taken together, have the ability. They don't have the deep pockets that the federal government has. When you look at the budgets of every single city in the nation and every state, the total combined is about $3.5 trillion. But as we've said, the bill that needs to be paid is $14 trillion. So you would need to have those, every city in the country and every state in the country would have to dedicate 100% of their budgets for 4 consecutive years in order to retire that debt. And they would have no money with which to operate their cities and states. So that's not going to happen. We know that's not going to happen, right? But the other part is that the federal government is the culpable party. The federal government could have resolved this problem at the end of the Civil War by fulfilling its promise to the newly emancipated people and giving them those 40-acre land grants. Right? This is land that would have stretched across the Sea Islands of South Carolina, all the way across to the mouth of the St. Johns River in Florida. A total of 5.3 million acres of land. Yeah. Right? Now, importantly, the federal government would have needed to have kept in place its military apparatus across the state to protect those free people and their rights to this property. Because certainly there would have been, white people who would have tried to take it from them, challenged them, for that land. So the federal government could have taken care of the racial wealth gap, at that moment, but it did not. What it did do was make 160-acre land grants available to white Americans, including recent immigrants from Europe, through the Homestead Act of 1862. So basically what happened there is that white Americans were invited to take land that was in the Western Territories. Now, this is land that was just very recently occupied by Native American people, basically fulfilling, completing the settler, the nation's settler project. They were part of this moment of pushing these Native people off their land. Now, it's important to note that the land that the newly emancipated people would have occupied is land that had been abandoned and confiscated from the Confederates. So this is not, if you go even further back, that land is land that they had taken from Native peoples. But this is a distinction. The The Homestead,
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
The Homestead Acts, comprise about 287 million acres. That's a land mass that's equivalent to all of Texas and California combined. That's a lot of land. And if you think about it, this is land that these individuals could live on. You could subdivide it. You could lease it. Any wildlife, any water, mineral rights, any lumber on the land, that was yours to use or to sell at your discretion. And importantly, any profits from that land and the land itself could be given to your offspring, and they could pass it down themselves to their own offspring. And this is exactly what happened. We know that today, 25% of all white households have a wealth position of at least $1 million, but only 4% of Black households have wealth of that amount. One example of how the Homestead Act played out. One of our colleagues, Jennifer Mueller, worked with her students and asked them to interrogate their own family's wealth positions. Find out if there's a Homestead Act in your family. And her students were very skeptical about what they would discover because they'd never heard anybody in their family mention a homestead land patent. But in fact, when they began to take a look, they discovered that fully 25% of the students' families, these white students' families, had a Homestead Act, a land patent, and none of her Black students. It's like a class of about 150 students. Yeah. And not a single Black student had a homestead patent in their family. And you can look all this up. This is all online, available online now. But one of the students shared a story about their, I think, great-grandparents who were given land in the panhandle of Texas. This is that northern 26 counties in the sort of a little rectangle of Texas. And they decided not to live on the land. They decided they would lease it. So immediately they're receiving, a revenue stream from this government gift, basically. And but sometime later, the patriarch died, and his widow and their 8 children decides that she will move to Austin, Texas, to give the children a greater, opportunity to go to college. 6 of the 8 children do receive a college education, college degrees. They emerge debt-free because she's able to afford for them to go to school. Then the matriarch dies, and the 8 children decide they will continue to lease the land and to split the profits 8 ways. So it's still, the gift is still, flowing from the federal government to this family. Then in 1980, a full 100 years after the patent was made, natural gas is discovered on the property. And the deposit is so rich that in the first year alone, the profits are over $100,000. So it's like, getting a monthly dividend check from the federal government. This is what white Americans have received from the federal government. In fact, the most recent land patent was completed in 1980 in Alaska. And this is what Black American descendants of U.S. slavery have not had. This is why we say the federal government is the capable party and it's the culpable party. And also that states and localities, schools, colleges, corporations cannot meet this debt.
Apropos of that, there's a comment in the chat that I think is pertinent. And it's from Nicholas Money, who says, I agree with the issue of ethical culpability, but the federal government is dependent upon taxation and debt that is paid for and held by citizens in the end. Then we, the people, must pay for reparations. And this is a very, very important point, and it's one that is critical from our standpoint in distinguishing between the capability of the federal government and the state and local governments. The federal government, in fact, is not constrained by tax revenues. And what should make that very, very clear to us is the capacity that the federal government demonstrated to fund relief during the course of the Great Recession, and more recently to try to address the economic consequences of the pandemic, where overnight the federal government assembled huge sums of money without raising taxes. Now, what is true is that the federal government essentially spending by printing money, and I'm putting that metaphorically, does raise the risk of inflation. And so in our discussion in the final chapter, From Here to Equality, we talk about ways in which a non-tax-based reparations program could be funded with a minimal risk of inflation. And we talk about two fundamental strategies, which addresses one of the other questions that's in the chat. One approach is to spread the payments out over a number of years, although we say that we would not like to see those payments stretched out beyond 10 years. Now, individual recipients might say that they want to receive the funds over a longer period of time, and that would also help mitigate the inflationary effects. But the other way in which you could mitigate the inflationary effects is by providing direct payments to the eligible recipients that are not necessarily cash transfers. There are other less liquid ways in which people can be provided with the payments, including perhaps annuities, trust accounts, and other types of endowments where the funds could not be spent immediately. And so as a consequence, it would be possible to minimize the inflation risk in that way. And the last point I'd like to make is I think people make the assumption that if individuals receive reparations payments, they will necessarily spend the whole amount. But I think it's more accurate to consider that the majority of the funds would actually probably be put into some form of savings. And again, that would help mitigate the inflation effect. But the key point is the federal government is not constrained by tax revenue.
All right. Thank you so much, Ms. Mullen and Dr. Darity, for giving us a very brief but important view of the scope and the scale of this issue and all of the possibilities that exist for us to address it as important. I think we rarely get this sort of vision of what is possible and imperative as we make efforts to move towards a just society, and I very much appreciate your work in this area. Before I wrap up, Rodney, did you have any comments you wanted to add?
Brilliant, wonderful, fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Just quickly before we wrap up, and a recording of this with closed captioning will be available on the Western Center for Social Impact and Innovation's YouTube page in the coming weeks. But I would like to thank, in addition to our panelists, the Western College Alumni Association for their generous support of tonight's events, as well as the many faculty, staff, and students who helped to make the event possible, including Western Center's current collaborating scholar, Dr. Rodney Coates, the Western Program's director, Nick Money, and the Western Center's coordinator, Billy Sims. Last but not least, all of the students at the Western Center who make this work possible. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of the night. And thank you, Ms. Mullen and Dr. Darity.